Yes.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So today I probably won't even take 30 minutes because this is pretty preliminary work that I've been working on with my colleague, Ron Durst. We're both really interested in tax policy, and we got started looking at, maybe there's some migration responses to changes in the earned income tax credit program. So for those of you that don't know, the earned income tax credit it's an anti-poverty program. It's kind of a counter to the kind of traditional cash transfer welfare program. And the way that works is it's a subsidy to earned income. So some percentage of a participant's wages are refunded to the individual. And it's usually up to about $7,000 max. So the way that the EITC is designed is to combat poverty through increased labor force participation. And so there's just copious literature out there about labor force participation. There's lots of papers that have shown that it does work in this regard in terms of getting people to participate in the labor force. There's also literature that's shown reduce in poverty rates for both rural and urban areas. And so one of the things we started to think about is if there's an increase in labor force participation in response to an increase in EITC, might we see, if different states have their own programs with different levels, might we see a migration response to increasing state levels of EITC? And so one of the foundations of that premise is, are poor people likely to move? And there's been some research on this. I know our conventional wisdom is that poor people don't move, but there are some studies that suggest that they are more mobile than we might think. All right, so this study, we are going to examine, right now it's just really the association between EITC and migration. We're hoping to achieve causality in the future. So we're looking at whether an increase in a state's EITC increases migration into that state, and then whether there's differences in the patterns of migration for rural and non-rural areas. Okay, so we basically do this by creating two data sets in a sense. So the first one, under the movers to rural counties, basically we're looking at all the movers to a rural county, and we're gonna break them into different categories. So whether they come from within the same state or outside of that state, so within state I or from another state, state J. And then we're going to further distinguish between whether they came from rural or urban counties, and same for out-of-state movers. And then we do the same thing on the urban side. So I'm going to add up all the movers to urban counties in a state, and distinguish between whether they come from within the state, out of the state, and whether they come from a rural or urban county. The data that we use, it comes from the urban rural codes that URS publishes to distinguish counties. We use the state EITC rates published by Clevin. So what's nice about these rates, he publishes them in terms of the percentage of the federal level, so presenting the state level in terms of what percentage of the federal level. Nice standardized way to present it. And then we're using migration flows, county to county, 2010 to 2018 from the ACS 5-year estimates. Just to give you a sense of the movers in our data set, the average moves. So on the top, we have the destination, whether they move to a rural county in a state or a non-rural county. And then along the side, we have their origin. So whether they came from a rural county within the same state, that's about 670, or moving from another rural county, kind of moving rural to rural within the same state, about 4,000 are moving rural to non-rural within the same state, and so on and so forth. So we have non-rural county origin, so movers from non-rural to rural within the same state, non-rural to non-rural within the same state, about 180,000. Out-of-state movers are the last two rows, so rural to rural, about 400, moving from out of state, moving from a rural county to another state. Urban county is about 2,200, and then non-rural to rural, 45,000, non-rural to non-rural, about 200,000. I wanted to just present the state EITC levels just to demonstrate that there's some variation. So we're going to exploit the variation both temporally and geographically to in our estimation. So there's, you might expect that the states that have earned income tax credit would be sort of clustered. But they're fairly spread out geographically. At least there's representation in all the regions of the US, and quite a bit of variation in level. So from 0% up to, the category says up to 40%, but it's really 18.9% is the highest. And this gives you a sense of the change in the EITC over time. So I just wanted to give you a sense of, at our starting point in 2010, about 23 states have some level of EITC, and that's going to increase to 29. And there's going to be states that are increasing that, and also so not all states increase, some some decrease, and some eliminate their program. Okay, so our methodology is pretty simple. We have a panel. We're going to use a two-way fixed effects model. There's a generalization of a difference in difference to multiple time periods and continuous treatment. So on the left-hand side, we're going to use the number of movers into a state from various origin, that could be within a state or external to that state, and whether they come from rural or non-rural. And then we have the EITC as that percentage of the federal level. The results are presented in this table. So you can see the results are presented by the mover's origin. So whether they come from within a state, urban or rural, out of a state, urban and rural. And you might wonder why we included these within state movers. and this is in some sense to provide a control, right? We shouldn't expect people within the same state who are all experiencing the same increase in the EITC. There shouldn't really be an incentive for them to move. The incentive should be for people external to the state to move into that state, and so gives us some kind of check on whether there's something else happening here. And so what we find is that, so this is movers to urban counties. So for every 1% increase in the state EITC, that induces, or is associated with, I should say, a 1.2% increase in movers from rural counties out of the state, and about 0.5% increase in movers from out of state urban counties. Now, we don't see the same statistical significance in terms of movers into urban counties. I mean, perhaps there's a greater search cost in terms of finding a job in a rural county. If you're moving state to state, it's probably easier to find a job in an urban area. But there's something to really kind of dig into more. So like I said, this is it's pretty rudimentary right now. We're just kind of in that exploration stage. There's certainly, our model doesn't have any controls except state and year fixed effects. So there's lots of opportunity to add, something about job prospects. We don't control for any other policies that might, be coupled with EITC. Maybe states are likely to implement something else in conjunction with EITC, which is possible. I don't know what that would be off the top of my head, but we're looking at exploring some of these things. So if you have any ideas, I would be so happy to hear them, or questions. But yeah.
Okay, thank you both, Tia, for the presentation. Do we have any questions from the audience? Or you can put your questions in the chat box.
Yes. I don't think I can see the chat, so if anything pops up, would you let me know?
So I do have one question. Sure. So in the first few slides, you showed the numbers of the movers from rural to urban, that table. So I saw no matter it's within state or out of state movers, and the non-rural to non-rural, the urban to urban, the number is quite large. So do you have any insights why this is happening? So I'm guessing that is because the population is large.
Yeah.
Right. So then have you thought about to weight your regression using the population?
Weighting it by the population. Yeah, I mean, that would be a really good idea. Yeah, so yeah, we use the log, which gives us a sense of percentage change. But certainly that would be a logical next step. Yeah, to weight it by the population to see what effects persist. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and also for the ACS, do you know? Oh, I don't think you know that. So there is no information about why the reason people migrate, right?
No, and we don't. I mean, this is why it's pretty naive at this point. We don't know their income level. We don't know. We just know they moved. We have a number from this county to this county. So we're trying to infer the reason for that move. But that's very tricky, right? It could be spurious. It could be, I mean, we are very, very cautious at this point that this is no way causal.
Yeah, but there is another way, like, because you know the destination and origin, the county, and basically you know how far they move, you know the distance. So probably you can look at the distribution of the distance, and that probably give you some idea to categorize these movers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you would expect low income people to move shorter distances, right? Is that the kind of, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's also some things we could do to exploit, like where I live in Kansas City, and we have a metro area that spans two states, and so there's also some things that we might be able to do with areas that sort of border states, or looking at it'd be pretty easy for somebody to hop just over the border to another another state and take advantage of their EITC. So yeah, absolutely. I think that absolutely distance is on our next steps, and also kind of these arbitrary borders, basically.
Yeah, I think this is awesome. Do we have any other questions from anyone else? Okay, so you can always think about questions. I guess we will have enough time in the end, and then we can come back to ask Tia questions. So thank you, Tia. Our next presenter is Jinshan Chen. So it's your time.
Thanks, Tia. Thanks, Juan. Let me share my screen. So, can everyone see the screen? The slides? Okay. So, I'm Jinshan Chen. I'm a postdoc associate in the Ag Econ Department, Mississippi State University. This is a work in collaboration with my major advisor, Charles Tao, who is an associate professor in the Agriculture and Resource Economics Department, University of Connecticut. That's where I graduated from. So we're trying to build a dynamic sorting framework over the dual risk of coastal housing market. The dual risk being the price risk and the flood risk. So we basically want to ask 3 research questions. The first is how the flood risk and the price risk affect locational decisions in coastal housing market. And second is we're trying to measure the willingness to pay for flood zone and ocean view. The third is how the effects and the willingness to pay differ across groups and over time. This is sort of something motivate moving decision, kind of related or similar to Tia's work. But we are trying to build a very complicated model to infer the information in their location decision or personal behavioral pattern or preference pattern. So there are 2 factors that make this topic interesting and important. The first is flood risk and price risk coexist in the coastal housing market, but the dual risk is not jointly studied, or separately, they're not really well studied as well. The second thing is, as we all know, the climate change and sea level rise are now widely recognized as a policy priority. So policy simulations would be needed by the policymakers now or in the very near future. The dynamic sorting framework can enable us to do policy simulations. For example, the NI5P program, that's the National Flood Insurance Program, they're trying to approach actually fair insurance rate level in the coming decade. In plain English, they'll increase the flood insurance rate by significantly in the coming decade. So we can simulate how it affects the aggregated housing demand and composition in the coastal communities. As I just mentioned NFIP program, I have to mention the flood zone designation associated, coming along with it. So if you are in the flood zone, your house is in the flood zone, you'll be subject to a set of flood zone specific regulations and also encouraged to purchase flood insurance. And here I'm comparing the flood zones with the sandy surge data. Sandy surges are those areas that are inundated in Hurricane Sandy. So they are the red areas, or the shaded areas are the flood zones. The take-home message from this map, as you can see, all the sandy surges are in the flood zone. I mean, basically, there's some exceptional case here, but generally that's the case. So I would say the flood zone is quite a good flood risk indicator from this map. So that's why we use it as a primary flood risk indicator throughout this study. So this is a New Haven area in coastal Connecticut. For the time being, I only introduced two most relevant papers. There are a lot of other previous studies. So the first paper is the initiation of the dynamic sorting framework. That's Bayer et al. 2016, published in Econometrica. So they are trying to use the dynamic sorting framework to measure the willingness to pay for certain public goods, like air quality or crime rate. However, afterwards, there's little application of that dynamic sorting framework in flood risk related studies. So to the best of my knowledge, this would be the first one to apply it to flood risk related issues. While we also have a plain sorting framework applied to flood risk setting. So for example, Bakinson and Moore, 2020, I believe in G, they try to estimate the willingness to pay to avoid flood zone using a plain sorting framework without dynamics. So applying dynamic sorting framework can provide improvements in two aspects. The first aspect is that the dynamic sorting framework gave us a mechanism to avoid the non-experimental instrument for prices and the associated problems. The second factor is that dynamic sorting framework include or involve expectations in individual preferences or behaviors. That allows us to avoid the potential bias for ignoring the expectation. If you think about the flood zone in Connecticut, it's not an area that's flooded so much, not like Mississippi or like Louisiana. It's not an area that's inundated so much. So people, when they think about whether I should purchase a home in the flood zone or versus not, just consider, okay, will I be flooded in like 10 years or 20 years, or maybe in 30 years? So expectation is kind of a very important factor there. So that's why including the expectation would avoid bias in estimated willingness to pay. And of course, I need to mention that there are a lot of hedonic studies trying to get the value of flood zones. Okay, here's a roadmap for the whole presentation. So we'll go through the data and conceptually go through the model. Then we'll present some marginal willingness to pay results. The simulation results are still not available yet. It's still ongoing the work. And if we have time, I'm going to show you some comparisons, like advantages or disadvantages of this dynamic sorting framework versus plain sorting or hedonics. But I bet we don't really have time for that, I guess. So the first set of data set we use is the property level data set. We collected the assessment and sales information from 1998 to 2020. The major source is ZTrax. We also checked the ZTrax information against property cards and land records. What we find is ZTrax data is usable, but we do find inconsistencies. We revised the ZTrax information based on the property card information and land records. The second big group of data are risk factors. Here I only present two. That's the flood zone related indicator or data set. The first one is the flood maps. That's basically acquired from the FEMA database, public ones. While the second set called LOMARs, that's short for letters of map amendments. Those are individual revisions, and they typically do not, typically are not reflected in the flood maps. That's why we have to collect them to get the precise assignment of flood zone status. So the older ones cannot be acquired from the FEMA database. We have to go to the local offices to collect the older ones, the old LOMARs. Okay, then it's the GIS data. The most important data set for this study would be the LiDAR data. We collected the LiDAR data for coastal Connecticut and calculated the ocean view for each property on the coast. So of course, we have a lot of other amenities and disamenities from this geographical data set. The last set of data is HMDA data. It's short for Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So it includes a household income, race, loan amount, check ID, and lender name. So they are only available for home buyers purchase the home with mortgage. The last three indicators can be used to match with the property data. So before we get into the model, we need to talk about some basic assumptions. The very basic assumption of this dynamic sorting framework is that households are making a sequence of locational decisions that maximize their aggregated life utility. The dynamic link is established in the sense that households expect different appreciation or depreciation trends in housing prices, and then they based on that and other things to make their locational decision to maximize their lifetime utility. Well, those locational decisions also include moving costs. So we specify financial moving costs and the psychological moving costs. Those are important since it's the decision rule would be only when the net gain in expected life utility exceeds the total moving cost, will the household decide to move? While the coefficient of the financial moving cost can be estimated from the first step, a relatively easier estimation, then that will give us the second step coefficient of price. So that's basically the marginal utility money. That way, we do not need to instrument the price. I just mentioned that the basic assumption is that people are looking at different price trends of different locations and make their locational decision. So we have to have price trend. We do have price trends in the average price on the coast of Connecticut. So before the Great Recession, the price doubled, basically doubled in 10 years before the recession. Then 10 years after, it decreased by about 30%. Right? It's the same no matter you break out the average price by flood zone or by whether they have an ocean view or not. We do not only need price trend, we also need different price trends. So here's the neighborhoods we have in this area. While we look at the pre-recession appreciation trend, we do find the great heterogeneities. It ranged from 0.265 to 0.917. That's the annual appreciation rate. Looking at the post-Great Recession depreciation trend, we also have a lot of heterogeneities. No, slightly less than what we have in the appreciation trend. So that's to say our basic assumptions are generally held in this region or in this market and this period. So let's look at the model. So just conceptually, I don't think I have enough time to go into all the details. So we have different household types and different choice set that is different residence types. For each household type, they'll have a per period utility for each residence type. Then they will aggregate that into a value function or net present value, so they can get their lifetime utility for living in a certain residence type. They will make their decision. We specify their decision as a discrete choice model, so we also incorporate the moving cost. So the household finally makes their location decision. That's what's observed. We need to back up the parameters in the property with that locational decision. So the process will be split into two steps. The first step is to using the location decision to estimate the value functions of dwelling in each residence type. Then with the value functions, we kind of do some decomposition of that into a flow utility. Then we further break down the property into different marginal utilities. One thing worth mentioning is that the household type is potentially changed in the process, since the moving cost will be a kind of a significant amount, and it will change the household's wealth type. So here are some details. So we specify residence types and household types in the coastal region. So in total, we have 47 residence types. So there are around 4,000 single-family residences in each residence type. And the household types are defined by wealth, income, and race. And also whether they're incumbents or newcomers, since they have different local experience and kind of different perspectives. Are also structurally in the model, we need to give them different assumptions. So the results of the first step estimation would be the value functions as well as the marginal utility money, because we use the financial and psychological moving cost in the first step utility function estimation process. So then breaking those value functions into flow utility, we assume a Markov process in the expectations, and I'll just skip that. There's quite some details there. The utility decomposition, that's a flow utility, decompose it into marginal utilities of different residence type characteristics. So those residence type characteristics include ocean view and flood zone. So as you can see here, we use the marginal utility money, gamma, estimated in the first step, and add that into the left-hand side. So that's basically the coefficient of the price. That's the user cost per period. And then we do not need the instrument for the price. So then we just need to run regressions, and simply we get marginal utilities as the alphas. Then we use the alphas to construct the marginal win space. Okay, so following are some results. The first set of results are the marginal utility money estimates. So the parameter to be noticed kind of is that FMC. So that's basically the marginal utility money. That's a baseline. We estimate it as 0.01 in Connecticut, coastal Connecticut, while Bay Area et al. Estimated the same parameter as 0.03 or 35 in Bay Area. It's kind of 3 times of what we estimated. It kind of makes sense that people are having higher marginal utility money in the Bay Area than coastal Connecticut. But I'm not quite sure whether this discrepancy makes sense. Yeah, we need to check that again. Okay, the second set of results are the marginal space for the flood zones and for 1% share increase in the minority share. Since we investigate the marginal willingness to pay for the minority share, we break down the sample by ethnic groups. That's basically non-minority and minority. So the general trend here is that it's the non-minorities tend to buy flood zone houses pre-recession, in the pre-recession period, while after the recession, it's a minorities tend to buy homes in flood zone. It's the same trend for newcomers and incumbents. We think that might lead to, or at least there's some kind of momentum to raise specific agglomeration. And also you can tell that from the fact that minorities tend to pay a positive point for increase in minority share, while non-minorities tend to pay a negative amount of money for an increase in minority share. Okay, then is some results about the marginal willingness to pay for the flood zones and for ocean view. So this time we break down the sample by income groups. So generally, you can see people are willing to pay more for having ocean view than avoiding the flood zone. And in the pre-recession period, incumbents are willing to buy any properties along the coast, regardless of whether they're in the flood zone or not. So that's the same for the previous table, and it's the same, and it's true here. It's kind of indicating that maybe people have some unreasonable decisions pre-recession. And there are a lot of discussions about the coastal home bubble in the pre-recession period. So in general, the estimated willingness to pay for avoiding the flood zone are higher than those estimated in the sorting framework without dynamics, like in Bakistan Mall. So that's the difference kind of made by including the expectations. So the simulation based on those estimates will kind of go backward, right? And we can simulate the increase insurance rate. We can simulate the flood map 2.0. That's the more granular flood risk levels. And also we can simulate some natural changes like sea level rise and flood map expansion. All of them can give us some aggregated housing demand changes or composition changes in the coastal communities. Okay, I think I'm about to, yeah, that's about the time. So potential improvements and future work. I believe we can have some better data for household characteristics, since the home data only provide household purchase with mortgage. And as we believe that home buyers without mortgage kind of behave slightly differently with respect to, compared with those with mortgage buyers. Also, we can expand this framework to other regions, like easily to inland Connecticut and to other states. Also, I need to complete the simulation to check what we have for the policies. Any questions and suggestions are welcome, since this is still a work in progress. Thank you, everyone. Questions or suggestions, please.
Jinshan, I do have one question. So I missed something. So when you formalize your utility function, and for the amenity of the housing, you consider whether it has an ocean view or whether it is in the flood zone. Do you consider any other amenities in your utility functions?
Yes, I do. Sorry. So in this alpha x, alpha x is kind of a vector of variables, right? It does include the flood zone and ocean view, but it also includes a lot of other amenities, not necessarily coastal amenities, but since we have limited, limited household type and limited residence type, we have only several hundred number of observations in the second step estimation. So we do have some limitation in including a lot of residence type characteristics or amenities or disamenities. So we include several others, but not all of them. We do have a lot of other amenities, but we cannot include them all here. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think one potential extension is that we can expand the sample to the Northeast region, then we can include more amenities. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and for the utility function is a discrete choice function, right? It's not a continuous one.
No, I think I didn't really make that clear. The first step, estimation, is from the location decisions to estimate the value functions. That's a discrete choice one.
Okay.
Yeah, so when you get the value functions, you can decompose them. Then way there's a continuous utility variable, and you can just use that to regress that on the different characteristics. So that's kind of a continuous decision.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, so I guess if you have any questions, you can always reach out to Jinshan. In the end of the meeting, 3 of the presenters will put the email address in the chat box, so you can always reach out. Thank you, Jinshan.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Okay, so I guess it's my. So hello everyone. Today I'm going to present one paper which is about environmental justice. This is a very recent paper. We just have some like background information and motivation. So any questions and suggestions are very welcome. So this paper is co-authored with Rohao Zhang from Northwestern and Neha Khanna from Binghamton University. The focus of this paper is environmental injustice. So as we know that the minority and the low-income populations, they always live in very dirty areas. So environmental justice becomes a very popular literature recently. So if you look at their conclusions, their findings from the recent environmental justice paper, they always conclude that the poor people, they always live in the dirty areas, and the rich people, they live in the clean areas. Okay, so that is the focus of this paper. And in our paper, we try to understand this environmental injustice using an intergenerational perspective. So basically, we want to look at whether there is intergenerational correlation between the environmental justice, between the environmental exposure. So in other words, we want to look at your grandparents, your parents' environmental exposure, and see whether you are still living in a similar environment with your grandparents or parents. So this is the uniqueness of this paper, because most of the environmental justice paper, they only focus on the one single generation. So we try to extend this literature by looking at several correlations, several generations. So the idea is very simple. We try to link everyone's childhood environmental exposure and their current environmental exposure, and to look at whether there is a high correlation. Are you still end up with in a similar environment? And this is actually the background of this paper. Our main focus of this paper is we try to look at this correlation and build up this phenomena using like several decades of data. And eventually we want to understand why people sorting themselves into the similar environment rather than jump out to a different environment. So basically, in the end of this paper, we try to come up with some equilibrium sorting model to understand the people's behavior in terms of how and why they choose different areas to live. So the contribution of this paper is, for most of the environmental justice paper, they only focus on the aggregate level. Basically, they link the for example, air pollution or water pollution in one area, and the demographic profile in these areas, and to see the correlations between the two variables. But in our paper, we try to look at this correlation in the individual level. Basically, we want to look at every individual's exposure and where you live. So that is the first contribution. The second contribution, as I said before, we try to bring the intergenerational perspective into the environmental justice literature to see, to understand why there is a persistence of environmental exposure. And also, we try to use this to understand what are the reasons to drive these persistent racial disparities. So in terms of, because I said there is some persistence of environmental exposure. So basically that is the motivation of this paper. So in this slide, I use the EPA's monitor data, which is the PM 2.5, to show the trend of national trend of PM 2.5. So the red line is the average PM 2.5 from the monitor sites. And the green line is the 90th percentile representing the dirty areas. And the blue line is the 10th percentile representing the cleaner areas. As you can see here, over 20 years, the PM 2.5 declines across the 390 monitor sites. And in Coma et al. 2020 paper, they basically using the combined monitor data and satellite data to look at the PM 2.5 trend over almost the entire country's the census tracts to look at the PM 2.5 trend. And they show the similar trend using data from 1981 to 2016. As you can see here, over the 40 years, the PM 2.5 declined dramatically. So that is a good thing. However, when you look at the relative disparities in PM 2.5, the story is totally different. So in this map, it's still from Coma et al. The map shows the difference of the PM 2.5 rank between 1981 and 2016. So the lighter areas means there is no change of the rank. And the blue areas means actually the PM 2.5 declines. The brown areas shows the PM 2.5 increases. So when you look at this map, for the majority of the country, the PM 2.5, in terms of the rank, it doesn't change. Although we see this declining trend of PM 2.5, but when you look at the rank, the position of this census tract over the whole country, it doesn't change at all. So this actually is our motivation of this paper. We try to understand why this is happening, why over like 4 decades, people still living, for the different generations, people still living in a similar areas in terms of the air pollution. So in this paper, this is just a summary of this paper. We are interested in understanding how an individual's childhood environmental exposure affects their expected environmental exposure as an adult. And specifically, we ask 3 questions. The first question is whether and to what extent the exposure to the low income quality can transmit from one generation to the next. So it's just a question about the correlation across different generations. And the second question is we try to understand in terms of the correlation, is there any racial gap? Whether the minority and the majority have different racial gap, have different correlation. And also we try to understand what are the factors driving people choosing similar areas to live. And as I said before, eventually we want to use a sorting model to understand why this is happening. So we gathered our sample from 2 databases. The first one is the panel study of income dynamics. This database provide us the individual information, including their family and individual characteristics, and also it provide us the geospatial identifiers for each individual. So basically, we know where you live. The smaller geographic unit is the block. But in this paper, we're using census tract because the PM 2.5 is observed at the census tract. And then the PM 2.5 is from Coleman's paper. This paper provides us the entire country, almost the entire country's PM 2.5 on census tract from 1981 and 2016. So because we know everyone where you live, so basically as long as I know which census tract that you live, I can link the PM 2.5 to your data. For each individual, we define their childhood as aged 16 and younger. And also we require a minimum of 4 years of data within this range to avoid the noise of the data. And on average, for each individual, we have 11 years of observations when they aged 16 and younger. And also we define every adulthood as aged 17 and older. And also we require the minimum of 4 years of data within this range. And on average, we observe 8 years observations for each individual. And then we just collapse the data to create a cross-section data. So in total, we have 4,000 individuals. This is just a distribution of the birth year when they were born to give you a sense of who are the people we are using in our sample. So most of them were born in 17 and 80s. So in terms of the PM 2.5, for the absolute value, the childhood PM 2.5 is a little bit larger than the adulthood PM, so which is consistent with the PM 2.5 trend when we see before, because over time the PM 2.5 declines. And in terms of the percentile rank, we don't see much larger difference, which is also consistent with the map we just saw. And this is just the PM, the distribution of the PM 2.5 rank for the childhood and adulthood. As you can see, they are very closely. The method is quite straightforward. We just establish the correlation between the childhood exposure and the adulthood exposure. So first, we estimate a rank PM 2.5 exposure correlation. So as you can see here, the correlation is very large. It's 0.84, and so this correlation just represents how close the environmental exposure, the PM 2.5 exposure for the individual during their adulthood with their parental environmental exposure. And if you plot the correlation by race, the blue line represents the minority and the red line represents the majority. As you can see here, if one individual, they grew up in areas with very low PM 2.5 rank. Basically, there is not too much difference when they grow up. However, if both minority and a majority, they live in very dirty areas. And when they grow up, it turns out the minority will face a much larger correlation, a much larger PM 2.5 than the majority. So which means they grow up from a similar environment, but when they grow up, when they choose their own like houses, locations, when they grow up, the difference is much larger than another pair where they grew up with in cleaner and similar areas. So this again shows us there is a racial gap between white and black in terms of the intergenerational correlation. And then we also use the regression to show the correlation, which is consistent with the graph presentation. When we have the interaction between the childhood and their racial status, we see that the beta 3, which represents the racial gap in the intergenerational exposure correlation. As you can see here, it gives us a positive significant coefficient, meaning for the minority, they will have a higher intergenerational correlation than the majority. And then we began to using the very naive regression model to understand what are the factors driving these results. So the simple way is we just add several family characteristics and see whether these variables can take away the correlations. So we included their parental education, their childhood household income, and whether they are grew up from a single parent family to represent the family structure. And the results shows that it turns out the 3 variables doesn't matter to channel the intergenerational correlation overall and by race. So it doesn't matter. So this naive regression just tells us, yeah, the family structure, family characteristics might now be the strong reason to driving the correlations and the racial gap. So as I said, this is just a recent work, and we just using these regressions to motivate our paper to say, hey, there is intergenerational correlation in terms of the environmental justice. And then the main question we really want to answer is why this is happening. We don't find any mechanisms behind this correlation. And but we do see there is a high correlation in terms of the environmental exposure across generations. So how do we understand this phenomena? So we try to use establish equilibrium sorting model to see when people sort themselves. We know there are many reasons, as Jinshan just presented. Maybe you care about, it depends on your wealth of your and income of your family, and also depends on the amenity of the housing of the location. So we try to using this similar angle to answer the questions, but we try to add another perspective to see, hey, if you want to choose a location to live, whether the childhood exposure or the environment plays some role into your sorting decision. So next step is we are going to explore an equilibrium sorting model to understand when people choose a place to migrate to live, how the environmental exposure, environmental amenities play a role in this choice, and also when they do this choice, how their parental, how their childhood environmental exposure influence their choices. So, again, we are going to using this sorting model to do some simulation and to using the simulation result to provide some policy suggestions to close the intergenerational persistence in the environmental justice, because the literature already suggested that to close to deal with the environmental justice, we need to provide the provide some policy, to promote the minority living in good areas. But in our paper, we try to use our study, our analysis to see how we close the intergenerational persistence in this environmental justice. So that is all for my presentation. And any questions, comments, suggestions are very welcome.
Hi, I thought that was so interesting and such an interesting perspective and a novel approach to looking at environmental justice. I wondered two things. What sort of have you kind of thought through the mechanisms that would explain this intergenerational persistence? You mentioned like maybe a preference formation kind of a and one thing that I was wondering is if there's kind of health effects that could then lead to, you know, job effects that lead to, you know, like lifetime earning of kind of story too. What do you, have you given any thoughts of that kind of a thing?
Yeah, so the channel you just mentioned is we can call income channel, right? So we know that poor people living in the dirty areas because they have the lower income. Lower income always, oftentimes they will lead to the less education for the next generation, and the less education will give lower income for the younger generation, and the lower income for the younger generation, they will end up to choose a place which is cheaper to buy. And also it will end up like a trap, like an environmental exposure trap. Yeah, so that is the major channel. Another channel is like a psychological channel. So if I live up like in a dirty areas when I was a child, and even though I got rich when I grow up, I don't care. So because I'm familiar with this neighborhood, right? So I'm still living, choose this neighborhood to live. So that is another psychological channel I can think of.
Yeah, no, that's really, that's really interesting. The only other thought I had was kind of that maybe this isn't kind of an unconstrained sorting, where you have like discrimination in lending and just, you know, discrimination in the housing market in general, like whether you've thought about maybe looking at policy changes in terms of, I don't know, something to combat the, you know, redlining, that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I think this is a good point. Yeah, I didn't think of like the housing market redline issues. Yeah, I think that is something I can introduce to the sorting model.
Sure, maybe kind of a constrained. Yeah,
part of like the. Yeah, I can think of how to introduce these characteristics of the neighborhood into the sorting model. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hi, Juan. I have a question. That's a very interesting topic, and well done. Do you mention that you have 4,000, about 4,000 individuals? That's individual, like that's tracks, or just the individual household?
That is just the individual.
Okay, individuals. Do you plan to acquire more data, or I suspect the 4,000 individuals won't be enough for sorting model. So do you plan to acquire more data somewhere?
No, we had the same concern about the size of the sample to do a sorting model. So far we don't have it, but even though we can get a similar data from like the other database, but I'm not sure how I can merge them together because they reported anything. Oh, I think this is a good point, because when we do the sorting model, as long as they all have the similar variables, we can combine them together, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think this is a good point. So maybe we can get several other database to combine them together to increase. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you for the comments. So we still have like 25 minutes. So if the audience have any questions from Tia or Jinshan or me, feel free to jump out, or you can leave your question in the chat box.
Hey, I have a question for Juan.
Hi.
This is Shanti. Great presentation. I may have missed this, but what is the average age of each individual in your sample?
Every age. So let me see. I don't have the number on top of my head, but because in the sample we collapse the data, so Oh, okay. So basically, we do have this. Let me show
Because you have a sketch, you have a histogram of what
Yeah.
the born
Right. So
year, right? So you can back off of that.
yeah. So basically, I know which year they were born. So from the average is something like 30.
Right. So okay,
40,
30.
yeah, like 45.
Okay, so maybe my question would be trivial, but I'm just wondering because you define adulthood as 16 or above, but then
Yeah.
before college, I suspect they're all gonna be living in the same neighborhood area before they are off to college, right? So in that case, then, well, because given that your average age will be 40 something, then that should be trivial. But then I'm just wondering if your adulthood, some part of it will be driven by, because some part of it will still be before college, from 16 to 18. So they will still be living in the same neighborhood. And maybe that will be giving, that's why it's giving you the correlation between childhood and adulthood, right? But then you mentioned that the average age is kind of 40 or something. So maybe this is trivial because it's probably not going to be a large portion of your adulthood sample. But I just wonder if that's any concern at all.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I can just check the sample, like how many individuals or how many years. Oh well, let me see. Oh yeah, that is a concern. However, like when I calculated the adulthood exposure, basically is the average average of the adulthood years. But in terms of your concern, we can just remove the college years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or maybe just redefine adulthood as maybe different years other than 16 or 17. See if just the correlation is still there.
Yeah.
If that's, then maybe then it should be fine. Yeah.
Right,
just
right.
a minor concern.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. If we don't have any questions, we can call it a day. So thank you for the audience coming here. I know it's like some last minute of the conference, but thank you for coming to our presentations and very interesting work from Pia and Jinsha. I learned a lot today. So I hope everyone had a good weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.